I can, it's clear? Okay. I've been to Russia many times and I know what that means. My Finnish grandmother had two older brothers in 1931 who turned communist from Michigan and moved there, and one was killed by Stalin in 37, and the other one survived for many years, and I was there several times and met them, and we spoke Finnish and English both. And fortunately, I didn't have to deal with Russian. But I've dealt as a professional researcher, not only with Finns, but a great deal with Swedish and Norwegian research, and also German, and a tiny bit of Italian, and even Icelandic, and that strains a person's skills. The sources I have today, I just want each of you to think outside the box. And when you hit brick walls and you think, oh no, I'm at a dead end, that's not always the case. You may end up there after everything I mentioned and what's in your handout, but we want to fight to the end because I'm not a person who gives up with this. So if I can get you to think outside the box and just have fun with your minds and talk to each other, other relatives, friends, neighbors, someone who is researching in the same state or the same ethnic group or speaks the foreign language that you don't have skills in, team up with these people because they can become your best friends and best resources. You may end up needing to get in your car and drive to other counties, other states. That can be fun because you get to meet a lot of other interesting people, hopefully see some new attractions and see where the ancestors happen to live, what the various occupations are here. The big one is obviously mining. If you're in the West, we also have Leadville and Park City and Bingham Canyon and northern Idaho. And these people, the miners, moved from one community to the other, depended on strikes and who was paying the most. We also have the copper country in northern Michigan and the Iron Range in northern Minnesota. And between Minnesota and the UP and Butte, the connections have always been really strong. And in the olden days, when the families had 8 and 10 children and half or more were brothers, and you can see they moved from one community to the other. And I'm not sure how much you are aware, but within the Finn community and Swede Finn, no matter where they lived, the guys from the same village or the same general area were great at corresponding. And sometimes these letters of 100 to 150 years ago surface. And it's just incredible to read what these people were talking about and trying to get them to move from one community to the other. When you do genealogy or family history, we all want to search the direct line as rapidly as possible and go as far back in time as possible. And we want everything to be perfect in our history. And if all of you think that's going to happen, including me, we can all leave right now because there are going to be surprises. And you simply take them as they come. And I have them in my family too. And I don't make any bones about it. Not everyone with a birth certificate has a father listed. And my Finnish great-grandfather was the 6th in the family, and they were all by immaculate conception. And I have been trying DNA and going through my mother's only male cousin in the direct line who died a year ago. And within a few weeks of his demise, the other cousin who lives there went to visit him and did the cheek swab and sent it in, and I have his DNA, but that was just barely in the nick of time. And out of 17 children in the family, and you come down 3 and 4 and 5 generations, Alan was the only direct male out of everybody. So never give that up. DNA is a very complicated topic, and I'm not going to touch on that today because you would need someone more skilled than me, and it in itself would be a day seminar. There are a lot of myths out there, and I happened to think of this a couple of weeks ago when I was putting notes together. And the greatest one that is between a myth and an open lie is that when the ships pulled into the harbor from 1819 to the present, the customs man, usually male, up until the very present time, often changed the names when people entered the country. This did not ever happen. It was not physically possible to happen, because from 1819 on, the US government required a manifest to be handed in person by the captain or the supercargo as soon as the ship docked in port. And during the journey, if you were on a sailing ship, of course, the captain had lots of time to make these manifest. And so it was his physical responsibility, no matter which country they came from, to the US government to turn in the full manifest. And in the early days, you had you had a date, the captain's name, the crew, the port they left from, the date they entered, and then you had all of the other people with a name, usually a year of age, and the country of birth, and hopefully an occupation. And if family members were traveling together, you would hope that relationships would be given, because not everyone was a father and mother with children. You had aunts and uncles, an unmarried cousin, a variety. So just be aware that the customs officials never changed anyone's name. And several years ago when Ancestry started the half-an-hour or hour-long programs, even there they talked about the customs officials changing names. So even Ancestry had it completely backwards. And people who have worked at the US various archives will promote what I just told you. Another one is, speaking about Scandinavians, but pertaining to the rest of continental Europe, there were always endless wars. Boundaries changed, people were forced to change languages when they moved here and there, and the myths go on that great-grandpa or some brother stowed away on the ship to avoid the draft, and he was going to work his way across the ship to pay for his passage. That physically never happened either. That's another great myth that Ancestry and other people are promoting. The security was too tight from the early 1800s on. The ships were smaller, the captain and the crew knew everyone, and they did not gain passage by coming for free. In the event it would have happened that you had a teenager stowaway on the ship, upon arrival in 1820, 1850, 1910, it would have been the responsibility of the sea captain to turn the person over to the customs officials and let the US government deal with that. The person did not work his way and then enter the country with no documentation. Speaking from what a Swede Finn, very dear friend, told me a number of years ago, and he proved it, until roughly World War I, most of the European countries with the passports did not include photographs. All you got was a physical description. And speaking as a Finn, and the Swede Finn who had relatives here in Butte, which came as a huge shock, because the Seamen's Mission in Butte sponsored the great-grandfather and his brother. And at 6,000 feet, we were never sure where the Seamen's Mission was located in uptown Butte. But it's recorded in the manifest. That has brought a chuckle forever. But anyway, getting back to the passports, Torbjörn had a friend in the early 1900s who was, the passports in Finland were always in 4 languages. English was not one of the 4. They substituted French at the time. And the relative was medium height, medium build, had blue eyes, light brown hair, and that was the extent of the description. Well, I can safely say that that somewhere covered more than 50% of the men. And the man was escaping the draft. And he managed to get from central Finland to somewhere in the States. When he got here, before too long after that, he mailed the passport back home to a relative. And after a short length of time, it was given to another man of the same physical description. And he used the same passport with the same name and managed to escape the draft. The passport, we know for sure, and I had even seen it, had 5 young men all come under the one passport with the same name. I don't know how common this was. I assume it could happen in other countries too, because there were no photographs. And therefore, if you have a descendant from the first man who came, and he goes online, he's going to find that Grandpa made the trip back and forth 5 times. And the family's going to wonder how this was physically possible, especially when you have an uncommon surname. Other people who are looking for their ancestor are never going to have a clue that he actually came legally, but under someone else's passport and name. So if you can't find someone, that is one option of why it was not physically possible. From the earliest days on, the US government had requirements that everyone who entered the country through one of the ports, and the Atlantic coast has roughly 200 ports historically. There are 10 or 12 major ports, but then between New England and Key West, Florida, you have all of these minor ports, and they required Manifest 2, and a number of years ago, the Family History Library went on a huge push to try and microfilm every single manifest that exists. And they did a really fine job. Like most of our immigrant ancestors, including mine, all of them were extremely poor, except my Flemish great-grandmother, who couldn't rub 2 pennies together, had 3 wealthy half-brothers who owned one of the largest businesses in southern Michigan, and they brought her and paid for the passage. She landed in Ellis Island on her 16th birthday, so that was easy to remember the date. But everyone else has these poor immigrant ancestors, and it was cheaper for every single shipping line to give breaks during the colder winter months when the North Atlantic and the North Sea were much choppier. It was colder weather, the ships were not full, and so they gave breaks. And if you came to the US, you still had to go through the physical health checks. Your eyes had to be in good condition, your feet had to be in good shape, and legs. You could not be crippled, you had to speak, you couldn't be deaf, dumb, or mute. There were all of these requirements, and they changed from one decade to the other. And people were quarantined if you were having a fever or ill when you came. And after a few days or so, if the person was well enough, then you could travel with the rest of your companions and go to your destination. In some cases, I don't know how many, but probably more than we would want to admit, the person had to travel back to their old country and was not allowed into the US at all. Many people came through Canada, especially after World War I. But even before that, if you came through Canada, the Canadian requirements for health conditions were very minimal, and as long as you were not with some contagious disease, you could enter Canada. And then Canada and the US had the agreement whereby if Canada had allowed a person to come into the country, the US automatically was required to allow the person to enter the US over any of the borders in the 3,000-mile border. So that was one great option. There are a lot of Canadian immigration records. Quebec and Montreal are not complete. There is a large collection that is mentioned here in your handout called the St. Albans Immigration Canadian Records. It's a misnomer because St. Albans was a tiny border crossing in Vermont, and somehow the name stuck. But this collection from 1894 through the late 50s covered every single border crossing from the Pacific Ocean to the Atlantic, all in one major index. And it's in Part A and Part B, depending on the years, but it's one huge index. And many people went back and forth. It could be just a tourist. It did not have to be an immigrant. Okay, getting on to a popular topic, and that happens to be adoptions. And almost everyone has either a relative who was adopted, a next door neighbor, a friend, and people always ask, if a person is adopted, what are the chances? My voice went out?
Yeah. Did you hit it?
It's on red. Is this working? Is the battery dead?
Yeah, keep on talking and I'll put the batteries in.
Okay. I don't know if you want this video recorded or not when it comes to adoptions, but I'll give you what I know. Generally, adoption cases across the entire country have to be 100 years old before the adoption records can be unsealed. Some states or counties may have altered that somewhat, but 100 years is a pretty good place to begin. If the person, the adoptee, happens to be deceased and you can prove it, that may give you an extra edge to getting an adoption file open, if that happens to be your goal. Another way to get around the 100-year event is if the person is deceased and you can get 3 county court judges together to sign a release, the adopted papers will be opened. The problem is getting 3 judges in one county, no matter the size, to agree to this is pretty slim in itself. There is another trick that even lawyers don't know. And I came across this a long time ago, and I haven't told it many times, except to a few individuals. But I strongly suggest that if you are looking for an adopted case less than 100 years old, go to the courthouse in person. And if it means driving to another state, you had better be willing to do it if you want to get the adoption papers open. When you get to the courthouse, there are 2 types of records. You have criminal records and civil records. Adoptions come under the category of civil records. There are separate indexes for civil and for court records. The indexes by law throughout the entire country, called docket books, are 100% open to the public. No court nor county court staff person can prohibit you from looking at the indexes, no matter what the case might be. Well, if you have adoption papers which were sealed X number of years ago, be it in the 1800s to the present, the civil court docket books must list the adopted couple's name along with some identification either for the child or the blood mother, and hopefully the father's name if the mother happened to be married. I suggest that you try to go incognito, just in case the court clerk is aware that there is a 100-year privacy law. But not only that, But the index is open to the public, and if you walk in and say, I'm looking for an adoption case, the clerk may try to pass off that this means that the index is also closed to the public, and it is not. It is open to the public. Yes.
Can I tell people in this county, good luck going incognito, because we all know Tom Powers. But it would be the district court. They have the criminal and civil docket. They have the indexes at the courthouse, and we have the files over here up to about 2010 or so, 2012. I forget.
So that's really current.
So, well, it's every, I don't remember how, I think it's 10 years or so is the time they have to keep them over there before they send them here, which is the repository. But we don't have the indexes here, so we can't pull them out for you to look at. But you can get them there. Tom will give you a cause number, and then you come here and you say, I'd like to see cause number da 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 da. And it's probably going to be on microfilm.
Throughout the country, most of the probate courts and the civil and criminal courts have the docket books out on the end of the table because the populations are all growing, the courthouses are always understaffed, and if you show up, they can just point you to the book and let you there with your own paper and pencil and do your own research, and they will leave you alone. They don't want you asking questions. You do your own research and be extremely thorough. And the docket books are in two columns, whether they call it plaintiff and defendant, or you have A and B. Be sure that whether it's alphabetical or chronological, that you are very careful to cover your bases, especially if you are traveling to another state. I mean, you don't want to make 2 trips and you don't want someone else doing this. You want to do it in person.
So if you were looking for an adoption and you had the mother's name, you would probably look for her name in the docket around the year that the baby was born.
You can even start a few days or a few weeks before the birth, hoping that documents were signed ahead of time.
Right.
And not always post-birth. You don't know until you find the entry. You have to think outside the box.
And this is outside of the 100 years or within?
Within the 100 years.
Okay.
The docket books are wide open.
So you could look at like 1942 and under.
You could even look at last year.
Okay.
But be very thorough, especially if you are traveling. And not only that, but in a few cases, I don't know how common this was, but there were 2 separate files, adoption files listed. One was the main adoption file, which may have been 1 or 2 pages. Adoption cases are not lengthy in this country. But I have seen other cases where there was a second file with more information than the official adoption file. And it may be a few days before or after, and the ones I have seen were open to the public. They were not sealed at all. And you get even more information than the actual adoption. How common this is, I don't know, but every case is different, and it depends on the judge and what was going on between the birth and the adopted parents. But you've got to be really thorough. In the event you still don't find the adoption case, it happened that the birth happened in one county and the adopted parents lived in an adjoining county. And if you're in Montana, this could be a long drive to check the adjoining counties. If you're back east, the drive is not going to take you more than a half an hour. But the adoption should show up somewhere. Especially if you have an uncommon surname with one or the other parents.
There's also the Florence Crittenden homes, which Florence Crittenden was a national organization that operated homes for wayward girls, as they were called back in the day, and they're still in operation. And online, they do have I forget what they call it, like their connection, Crittenden connections or something like that, where if you were searching and you know that your relative or ancestor was adopted through a Crittenden circle, that you could probably put your name in there, and maybe if the birth parent, birth mother, birth father also by chance put his name in there, there might be those connections. And that was a national organization. I just learned this week. I mean,
That's helpful.
just learned about the connecting sites there, so.
Perhaps 10 to 15 years ago, the state of Washington came up with a statewide adoption file. And if you were adopted yourself, you could have your name added in with your birth date and your address, a contact number. And in the event you had a birth parent still alive or a sibling, and they were searching for this half-sibling, they could be put into this register as well. And then with computers now, you could get these matches, and they would contact both parties, and matches were made. And one day I was in the family history library cranking away at microfilms. Obviously it was before computers. And all of a sudden the woman next to me stood up on the chair and screamed. And I said, "What's going on?" And she said, "I'm from Washington State and I just got a call and they found my brother." So she said the system works.
Wow.
Another hot topic besides DNA is health and genetics in general. And the word genetics is a rather new term. It doesn't go back to the 1800s. In the olden days, before genetics, we had what was called eugenics, Eugenics. And in 1900, there was a major push, I believe, by Temple University on the East Coast, who had a large number of medical staff, researchers of various kinds, and they wanted to track people with odd diseases and syndromes. And this eugenic office functioned fully from 1900 through 1940, so we've got four full decades when this happened all across the country. And it included mostly middle-sized cities, because they actually promoted for people to voluntarily come into offices here and there and fill out pre-printed forms and give information on themselves if they, or a spouse, a parent, a cousin, a grandparent, a great-grandparent had a particular disease or trait. And if any of you know what electrodactyly is, that happens to be a favorite one of my eugenics words. It means a person's hand or foot had 1 or 2 digits missing. And this can be genetic as well as just a fluke. And I know people who are missing the middle finger on both hands and 2 toes on both feet.
It must be fermented corn.
That's a very good
Just
guess.
saying.
That was due to the arsenic.
Okay.
Okay, these eugenics records cover more topics and diseases that I could ever imagine. And they were just really fun to read. Over the years, somehow they were microfilmed by the Institute, and they covered 247 rolls of film. So that's a large collection. And at one point, I was really interested in health and genetics myself, and they showed up at the family history library, all 247 rolls. And I went through withdrawals for a couple of weeks, and was there from morning till closing, and cranked through one film after the other, hunting for one disease and trait after the other. And I was hunting for locations. I wanted to know if there were any Finns who had electrodactyly. And it got to be really bizarre. The collection is difficult to use because it was all created by professionals. And the professionals like to use codes. And you think it would be the FBI who put the collection together. And it was indexed in 6 different ways by codes. And 3 of the codes, 3 of the indexes have been microfilmed and the other 3 never were. And after a year or 2, the collection was entirely pulled from the cabinets. And we kept wondering, what is the reason? You go to the drawer and the drawers were completely empty. And I had not completed all of the topics I wanted to research. And so I went through withdrawals, and maybe 2 years later, all of a sudden someone told me they had been put back into the cabinets. And they're still there today. With the Mormon branch libraries, they are not on interlibrary loan whatsoever. You need to go to the Salt Lake Family History Library in person, and you can use them from morning until they close at night without restriction. You can make copies, you can do whatever you want. The originals at some point were sent to the Dite Institute in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and they are still there. If you want to show up in Minneapolis, you are welcome to use them with no restrictions. And that's nice because instead of being back on the East Coast, at least if they're in Minneapolis, that's a little more central to much of the country. Or come to Salt Lake, and it takes some work. You are not going to do this in an hour or 2 or a day. You need to come and plan to spend some time. But many of these files that I went through included pedigree charts and family group sheets, somewhat an older version, often just handwritten with lines and arrows. But they covered 3, 4, and even 5 generations. And if you are trying to get these old relatives, and you are fortunate enough to have had someone come in with a disease A, B, or C, and you can find them, you have all of these other people who did not carry the trait, but they are still recorded, and you get birth and death dates and locations, and they can be incredibly informative. Even if your ancestors were not part of this study during the 4 decades, but you have a rare trait that you want to research, you can show up and go through locations state by state and find other people with the same disease or trait that interests you. And instead of doing Wikipedia online, you can actually get some in-depth research and copy the pages and take it home and study it, and you can see with these rare cases how it travels from one person to the other. And if you or someone in your family has the certain trait and you just want general information, this is a very good source because it's all open to the public and you can read through and copy until your heart's content. Oh, another interesting topic is the FBI records. And they started by Theodore Roosevelt and Herbert, what's his name?
Hoover?
Yeah, J. Edgar Hoover and C.J. Bonaparte in 1908. So the FBI records go back a long way. And at one point, there was an agreement made between the massive indexes of millions and millions of 3x5 cards that are in rows of cabinets longer than you would go from one end of Butte to the other. And there was the decision made that the Family History Library was going to microfilm them. The director of the FBI changed and put the kibosh on it, and so that never happened. However, there is an address, I give it to you here, it comes under the Freedom of Information Act. You can ask about yourself or any other person you want and give the necessary information so that they can make identification. and go through and they will search. And in past years, if you needed 20 pages or 25 in the file, they would copy it and send it out within a week, and the time lapse was unbelievably quick. And if you needed, the whole file was maybe 100 pages or under, they would copy the file as soon as possible, and they mailed it for free with no charge whatsoever. And there was one man I knew had a midlife crisis at Utah State, and he decided he was going to get a degree in history. Well, that caught my eye. And he wrote the FBI, and he was adopted, but before the mother died, on her deathbed, she told him who the real father was. Lo and behold, this was a number of years ago when Jim was midlife crisis, so we're talking World War I in the 20s and so on. He wrote to the FBI, and he got a letter back in the mail instantly, and it said, when we get time, we will be sending you a box. He called me up when it came, and I drove to Logan, and his wife said, you better plan to stay overnight a couple of days because we're going to read this together. He wrote his entire history thesis just on the history of his blood father, who had been in every state, from being a pastor in Minneapolis. He was a streetcar conductor somewhere else. He worked for the railroad. He had been in jail, and he was a bootlegger. He did everything from A to Z, and Jim had such a joy writing the thesis from the FBI records. My grandfather, who was an illustrious man from Kentucky, a Boone descendant, during Prohibition and the 20s, managed to hobo around the country on trains. And being a train fan, I thought his stories were such fun. And when a couple of the gangsters were shot in Chicago, Grandpa told stories of being 100 feet away. And knowing Grandpa and how he hoboed on the train, I thought, okay, this is probably true. And I wrote to the FBI on Grandpa and gave all of the info when he was still alive, but never told him. And it came back negative. So the FBI didn't have anything on him. And I was really hoping they were, but that's because I wanted to tell all of the relatives. Lighthouse Keepers is an off-the-wall topic. As I mentioned, I don't think the Seamen's Mission in Butte ever had a lighthouse. But then maybe I'm wrong. But Michigan has the most of any state in the country because it has the longest coastline. But Minneapolis and Maine and the rest of the coast have lots of lighthouses, some dating from the 1760s and 1790s, which may or may not still be in use, except they would be electrified. But most of the lighthouse keepers were apparently married and had living quarters within the base of the lighthouse, and the guys climbed the ladder up and down when needed. And I don't know why, but many of the men seemed to die quite young. And since the wife was living there and suddenly had no income and perhaps children, she applied to become the lighthouse keeper because she already had all of the skills, and within moments she could be hired on the spot, and the lighthouse never went out of business. And the National Archives has a huge collection on lighthouses, including all of the women who may have served more years than the deceased husband. People don't think about that source, but if you're dealing with National Archives records, that's an interesting topic. Kim, could you go get the military book, please?
A military book.
From your desk?
Oh, yeah.
Military records pertain to millions and millions and tens of millions of people. from numerous wars. And I have a book Kim is going to show. It was published in 1999, and it is incredibly comprehensive, and I started reading it a month ago. I already had the book, but I hadn't thought about using it for this purpose. And I started reading and said, okay, I'm going to need more pages for the military handout than I have altogether for the other topics. So I packed the book along. And if any of you have interest in doing military research, I strongly suggest that you buy a copy of the book, because with the various branches of the military and all of the wars and locations for records all across the country, this is the reference. Okay, pass it around and people can have a look. That's all I can say on military, because it's all right here. And it takes a lot of time to plow through it, but you will get answers.
The Montana Military Museum at Fort Harrison in Helena will help you with military research also.
That's
They're very
good.
They're
That's
very
good.
helpful.
They probably have this on their reference table.
Yeah. Could be, but
Oh, Federal Bureau of Prisons. It's abbreviated BOP, was created in 1930. These are not state prisoners, they're not county prisoners, only federal. And there are currently 122 prisons from my recent research with 160,000 inmates. And you can find information on all of them. Since 1982, they're online with full name, age, sex, current location, and/or when going to be released. And usually they have photographs. So if you have a missing person, that's another source. Oh, a lot of you may have ancestry from Copper Country in Michigan or elsewhere in the UP who comes through the Iron Range and on into Butte. Michigan, after World War I, had this marvelous idea that it was voluntary, but the veterans from the war could fill out lengthy forms about their full name, their birth, marriage date, where they served, family members, on, whatever history they wanted recorded, and turn them into the state. And the state archives has them. They have 266 microfilms, which have been digitized. And so if you were looking for a long-lost person, a relative in the old country, siblings, if you have a missing aunt or a cousin, you might find reference in these Michigan records. There's one very large national source that I need to find and promote. Okay, here it is. Many of us are looking for older records for the generations who have long died. However, if you want to expand your research, perhaps bring forward the siblings, children or grandchildren more to the present time, you have multiple options there. The Family History Library in the beginning, up until basically the present, never had any intention of microfilming anything beyond 1930. And originally, the cutoff date was 1900. So if you want more research, the Family History Library is not going to be your first choice. It's always good to check the catalog first, geographically by county and state, and see if by chance you get lucky. However, there are numerous companies during the last 10 to 15 years which have paid websites with annual subscriptions for finding people finders, and they go by various names. I think over the last 5 years, I have paid for at least 3 of the companies, and they were surprisingly cheap. None of them are expensive. They're $25 to $50 a year at most. And with them, I never had any negative experience at all. And my parents and I were involved, started 2 lawsuits, and we needed information on people in various states. And lo and behold, they turned up. And it was a great way to gain information because they have to all use public documents. And one of the companies said that if you find yourself in there and you want to be removed, send us an email, and within 3 or 4 days, your name will fade into oblivion. And I did that with myself, and lo and behold, the company followed through. But the documents that were out there, we were looking for some court cases in Florida, and we hit the jackpot. And I printed out 200 pages, and we took them to the judge, and he said, okay, you have won your case. And all it cost me was paid for the people finder company and the computer ream of paper and my time, and organized them, and you can't believe what we uncovered. One of the companies had my father and grandfather in there, who both had uncommon names. And my mother said when I was born that trend was going to stop, which it did. But I found my father in there, the locations for him and my grandfather in all of the places they had lived up to that point in their life were all very accurate. When it came to my father's birth date, they had the day wrong, the month wrong, and the year wrong. And with my grandmother, they had her birth date all wrong, but the rest of the information was correct. Some time ago, the Family History Library decided they did not want competition, so they started their own people finder. And currently, the people in it exist from, you had to be an adult, but they exist from 1970 to 2009. And in your handout, it's under United States Public Records Index. And there are currently 875 million entries in this one database. You can put in yourself or anyone that you want, a long-lost relative, a long-lost classmate, and if it covers this fairly current time period, you're probably going to get a hit. Most of them have an exact birth date, some have only a year, and from what I have found, they tend to be surprisingly accurate. And I give you the reference here. You can search this at home and just keep playing with it, and who knows what's going to show up. But it's all free. Just remember it covers those years, and you had to be an adult. So basically, you had to be born before 1950 to be in it, probably 1900 to 1950. And if you were born in 1995, you're not going to be in it because you are still too young. And one person can show up multiple times, and the only drawback is the Family History Library or Family Search only calls them public records. You don't have a clue where it comes from. You get some phone numbers, so you can pretty much guess it came from the old-fashioned telephone books. And the others, you don't have a clue. There is no point in contacting them because no one who works there will have a clue. They're only public records. So that's the drawback over the paid companies, because you will quickly see right there in front of you their source.
Where is that information on your handout?
It's under United States Public Records.
Top left.
And that is a tremendous source because the entire country is in it, not just one state.
And is that online through the
It's online.
Family History Library?
And can you say the dates again that it spans between?
1970 and 2009. And I don't know if they have any plans for updating that or not. If any of you have interest in Native American information and affairs, the U.S. Bureau of Indian Affairs has maintained extensive records since the early 1800s right to the present. Some of the later census records from the 1850 on have separate sections for Native Americans or Indian census. And they have different information than for the rest of the general public. The Bureau of Indian Affairs, a number of years ago, microfiched millions of pages of Indian records. And the Family History Library has a fairly complete collection from anywhere in the country. Most are on microfiche, and they are going to be available elsewhere in the country. You can search them on your own. And there is a collection. If you have interest, look under the state in particular, and then go look for Native Americans or Indians, and the collections will appear, and they're massive. Oklahoma is the best state because early in the 1830s, they had the 5 civilized tribes which were forcibly moved there. But each of the 5 tribes had a written language created. And all of the millions of pages there are for Oklahoma, you have the native language typed from the time typewriters came into being. And every single page is translated into English, so you have the original with the English translation. And it's a whole lot more fun just reading those than playing video games. I should mention about naturalizations, which Kim brought one of the volumes up, just for Montana. And there's a section under naturalization and citizenship. And Montana is not as easy as one would think, not even Silver Bow County or Deer Lodge County, because Montana has records scattered in other court jurisdictions, including the Federal Archives in Seattle, and through the Family History Library. Many of these are even online, so if you can't find your document of interest right here locally, try this out, and this I give you a general outline, and you may very likely solve your mystery.
Could you speak a little bit to Michigan naturalization paper?
More than 20 years ago, the state archives began to hopefully voluntarily call in naturalization records from each of the counties. And some counties sent them in. They were supposed to be microfilmed and returned, according to some county clerks. That never happened. There were very bad feelings. The Upper Peninsula counties generally did not turn anything in. They may still be in the individual county or at Houghton Tech University. They have some. But anyway, in the 90s, the state archives had volunteers who came in, and they tried to make indexes for each of the names with a reference in the counties. And that's a possibility. I'm not sure, but they used to be online for free, at least the index. And Michigan has been up and down for the last 15 to 20 years with funding for the state archives. At one point, the state archives, the state government even wanted to sell the state archives for a profit. And the genealogical societies all over the country put the kibosh on that one. But Michigan, if you want to talk to me individually, come afterward. You have lots more sources here. I will continue for as long as anyone wants to put up with me without throwing tomatoes. At some point, you will hit a dead end. on some of these cases. I know I have with my great-grandfather with DNA. I'm close to giving up, but I haven't gotten to that point yet. I'm hoping that somewhere I can find other matches with DNA, and then all of a sudden we're going to say, okay, this was the common father, and it was not really a miraculous birth. And at one point, before they became public document, I had political connections, and I got his Social Security form where he filled out himself about all of his information, and it asked for parents' names and birth names. And he gave his mother's name, which was accurate, I knew that, and she never came to the States. And when it came to father's name, he had to have one of the sons help with English, but in his own handwriting, he wrote unknown. So I knew from that he himself had not a clue. But anyway, when you hit these, after trying everything you can think of in traveling, and you hit what seems to be a brick wall, give it up and say, okay, this is it. And I'm going to be content with what I know, whether it's myth or truth or half-truth, and go on with another project where you can hopefully get some better results. But whether you call a person on the phone or you are driving to another location where you have not been before, pull into the local public library and get one of the reference librarians. The library may be so tiny that it has only one staff person. Or you may have a larger one with a lot of people, and you call on the phone and you have all of these options. And one of them is, if you're calling for family information, only call on this day or that day of the week, and call between this time when we will have a staff person to help you. That can be one extreme. But if you're new, show up and tell the person where you come from. If you're going to the South and you show up with a Montana accent, you won't need to tell them I'm not a local person. And lo and behold, that happens, but generally, no matter where you are, the librarians are friendly people because they have interest in books and topics and history, and they are as willing to deal with you in person as they would like to deal with you in person. And they can be incredible because if you need adoption help, and they can tell you about, usually the historical societies and the libraries and genealogical societies will have one designated person who is allowed free access frequently into the courthouses to go through whatever was wanted. And you had one here named Jim Johnson. I knew him really well. We knew each other well and had lunch together a lot of times at Front Street Market. And he was welcomed into the courthouse openly, and nobody ever questioned. But in your travels, you may find one person in the county, and get a hold of the person. Don't send an email. If you can't go in person, try calling online, because even that contact is more personal than a generic email, which now Americans can't even spell anything correctly. And so if you are contacting a librarian, they probably would appreciate good English. But they can be very great general assistance in your research because they know the local area. And if you need to have someone go, try to attempt to get an adoption case opened, get a local person who knows the system, knows the judges, and could step in for you. And for whatever the fee is, it's going to be worth it, because the local person may have a good rapport with the person who holds the key to the box. Okay, any other questions, or
Do you want me to explain kind of what we have
yes,
up
please
there?
do.
I'll
If
do
anyone
that.
needs to leave, thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Another good resource is the little local history group in Boulder, which is a little tiny town. We have a little museum and a lot of local history and genealogy. And so our librarian sends everybody to us, but we have a lot of information there. We have even read every local newspaper from 1885 to current and have every obituary that was ever published in those newspapers in Boulder. And so somebody comes in and says, well, I'm looking for my grandma. That's one of the first places I go because maybe grandma's obituary's there and will give us information.
Oh, I just need to insert this tiny bit of info, but there are lots of newspaper collections from all over the world online. And I can tell you, the University of Helsinki has the Finnish newspapers online from the very earliest days. You have the old-fashioned script, and then you have the Roman text. But Finnish names are often long. Why would you have a 5-letter surname when a 15-letter one is much better? And in the old newspapers, the columns were generally very narrow, including the Montana papers here. When you are looking with the digitized index, and you have these long surnames with a hyphen on one line, and then carried on to the line below, the computer search engines oftentimes are not going to pick up on the surname you are looking for. So just be aware that it might be in the newspaper, but if the search engine doesn't pick up on it, you need to try and find the original if you have a date or a week to go through, because then that could be one reason that you will be successful. And people think that if you have the search engine, it's going to be 100%, and they are not. When you are dealing with Finnish Gothic script,
Oh, anything.
anything would be better.
Montana, some of the smaller cities, smaller newspapers in Montana, week by week, month by month, they are being digitized, and the Montana Historical Society is offering those online for free. So those are searchable. I've got it bookmarked. A lot of us probably have that bookmarked. I can't remember what it's called, Montana Newspapers or something. But so that kind of helps fill in the blanks that you're not going to get with newspapers.com. And even newspapers.com, there are back doors into certain dates and areas that might not be picked up in a search engine. So, yeah.
If you have hospital records or state asylum records, state hospital records, whatever you want to call them, poorhouse records, since Roots came out and all of a sudden family history became popular throughout the whole country, that's when the courthouses and archives began to clamp down on public access, even though they're public documents. But if you have prison records or the state hospital records and you can now gain access, they had logs kept for each individual about the visitors who came, the date, and how long the person stayed, and when correspondence came, every letter and postcard was cataloged with the sender's name and address. So if you are looking for a long-lost relative and you can gain access through some prison records or asylum records, that could be your key to gaining. Because if you had Mary Anderson and she was the prisoner's sister, and that's her married name, how are you going to find a Mary Anderson in America? It's not going to happen. But if you can gain access to these correspondence logs, and it's going to take some real effort to do them, but that will crack your case. And questions, ma'am?
Yes. My cousin did genealogy research on my paternal side,